Kirkenes is the Land's End of Norway, a brand new town of some 5,000 people, rather proud of the fact that it had to be totally rebuilt after the war because, apart from Malta, it was the most bombed place in the world, or so they claim. But it has another claim to distinction, because Kirkenes is right next door to Russia. The signpost says, "To the Soviet Commonwealth." And the Soviet Commonwealth starts just a few yards away on the other side of this wire mesh gate with the rather inadequate padlock on it. I'm sorry I can't take you through the gate because pointing a camera at Russia from here is absolutely forbidden. You can point it along Russia, beside Russia, and in front of Russia, but not at Russia. And up there on that hillside, about 1,000 yards away, there's a Russian guard post, which has a pair of binoculars permanently mounted and manned, which is glaring right at us at this moment, which is a little disconcerting. On my right-hand side, there's a Norwegian guard post that also has a pair of mounted binoculars, but I understand that they're not very good binoculars. The Russian binoculars, on the other hand, are very good indeed. A few days ago, a German tourist managed to sneak some snapshots of Russia from here. Within half an hour, the Russians had hoisted a red flag which showed that they wanted to parley with the Norwegian guards, and had presented a written, formal complaint about the incident, which included the actual make of camera that the German had been using at 1,000 yards range. Ever since the war, the Russians and the Norwegians have been manning the 122 miles of frontier between their two countries. The Russians glowering suspiciously at the west through their powerful binoculars, the Norwegians shrugging their shoulders good-humouredly at the absurdity of this rather pointless border patrol. Because anyone who wants to slip across into Russia on skis can do so any night at all he likes, and telltale ski tracks show that this certainly does happen. But there's never been any trouble here at this border post, and that's why the Russians call this area the Valley of Peace. There's never very much traffic here either. The padlock on that gate doesn't get opened very often. The Cold War, as well as the climate, have seen to it that this border remains very frozen indeed. But now, suddenly, this spring, a big thaw is setting in. The most important factor in the thaw is going to be tourism. The Russian authorities have just agreed to throw this gate open with a vengeance this summer and allow in a horde of tourists. Tourists, what's more, without visas or passports. You see, over there, the Russians have a little town that they're very proud of. It's a sort of sister town to Kirkenes called Boris Gleb. The story goes that centuries ago, two Russian princes called Boris and Gleb committed a murder and vowed in penance that they would go as far north as they possibly could and start a religious foundation for their sins. That was the start of the town of Boris Gleb's, and the Russians have just completed a very extensive restoration job on it. They really are rather sold on this town. When the boundary between Norway and Russia was being fixed about a century ago, the natural place for it to be was up the river Pastvik, which flows directly north. But so keen were the Russians to include Boris Gleb within their territory that they pushed the boundary across the river, and then in exchange they gave Norway an enormous chunk of Russia along the north coast as compensation. This is the town that the Russians are so keen to have tourists see without visas or passports. Now, this summer, this rather un-Russian concession is going to apply only to Scandinavian tourists and only to the town of Boris Gleb. But next year it's hoped it's going to apply to tourists of all nationalities, and they'll be allowed to move much further afield. Meanwhile, for at least a year, this is the end of the Norwegian line for all British tourists. In my own case, on the other hand, there are occasions when it's quite useful to be a Scandinavian. From Norway, farvel.